Let's come back from our break, from our pause. Books are coming out now that are incredible in their insightfulness and going unread. Going not only unread, but unknown. And part of Parayana is to bring these orphans back home and to have a population. A book that came out just a year or so ago called The Horse, the Wheel, and Language by David Anthony. How Bronze Age riders from the Eurasian steppes shaped the modern world. It was in fact, for a while, a book club selection for the History Book Club. The horse was tamed in Central Asia, and the tandem of horses to pull a two-wheeled wagon with an axle that went between the horses, the chariot, was born there. And so that whole civilization of Central Asia, the working center pivot of it can be said to be Samarkand. Samarkand is on a great river, the Amu Darya River, and it snakes back to its origins in the high mountains of the Hindu Kush. And one can go along the Amu Darya. In fact, they did, in an ancient caravan trading route, originally by camels, that went along the Amu Darya and eventually was able to cross not the Hindu Kush, but to cross another pass that dropped down into what really we call colloquially the Gobi Desert. And to then etch along the foothills of a great mountain range, the Kunlun, the Dragon Mountains, mountain range as it arcs around, and following this caravan road, one eventually came to a place where two great rivers had a confluence down below in the plain along that caravan route, and there was founded a great early trading center. Its ancient name was Khotan, Khotan. The Chinese have since shortened it to Hotan, Ho being river. It's the river place where they come together. And one of those rivers came from a geologic deposition that yielded black jade, the dark spinach green jade. It's called black jade. And the other river came from a kindred but different geological setting, and it also had jade, but it had very light colored jade called white jade. So that Khotan, ancient Khotan, is where the black and white jade came together with the horses and the chariots, and I named that caravan route some 20 years ago the Jade Road, and it went further along the foothills of the curving Kunlun Mountains, skirting the ancient Gobi Desert, which was not as fierce at that time because the desiccation was not that far advanced as it became. In fact, there were eventually branch cities made out into what today is the Gobi Desert from that caravan route, that Central Asian civilization who eventually were able, about 2000 BC, to refine their language because they needed to have a written language. Their trade routes were going so far afield, and not only far afield along the Amu Darya into the Gobi area and along the Kunlun mountains, but the other way, they followed ancient Celtic ancestors. At that time, the followers of the ancient Celts were called Scythians, and Scythian jewelry and gold and so forth are a part of that civilization that then were put together in Central Asia around Samarkand. Their ancient Celtic ancestors eventually had gone far to the west alongside of various river systems and had taken themselves all the way to Ireland. So that by about 4000 BC, there were Celts in Ireland who were highly civilized. And 2,000 years later, there were civilized Scythian, and they were grouped in such a way that the horse caravans extended themselves all the way into China, what became China, and they are the ones who brought all of the flowers and fruits and jade, chariots and horses, and the Chinese were able to absorb those and found dynastic China. So that the first dynasty in China is called the Xia, have all of that inheritance of the Central Asian caravan route. The interesting thing is that when that civilization was put together about 2000 BC into a written language, the language is called Avestan. And the Avestan became refined about 400 years before anyone would have realized that the southern caravan route, which mirrored the northern caravan route in its great thrust to the east, also had a great poetess at its center, Enheduanna, the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, whose eventual linking of the original Sumerian sites with the original Eastern Mediterranean sites being connected by the Euphrates River system curving around and became a fertile crescent civilization. But so great was the genius of Sargon and his daughter Enheduanna, who made the language. At that time, the written language was in cuneiform, and it was an ability to bring together the farthest reaches from, as we talked last week, Ras Shamra, from the peninsula of Fennel. One could look out across the eastern Mediterranean Sea, the tip of Cyprus reaching out like a pointer of land. And from Cyprus to the Indus, the Sargon resonance of his trading routes went. And so the early Dravidian, as so-called, 1,000 years before there were Aryans in India, in that part of India, they understood that about 2300 BC, that there were trading routes that were open now, so that the Harappan civilization became, the Indus civilization became, the Mohenjo-Daro civilization became, great exporters of grain. They were fantastic at this. And in Sir John Marshall's excavations of Mohenjo-Daro, he found that one of the largest buildings archaeologically in the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro, because it was allowed by the invaders to go into ruin, and into ruin it did. One of the largest buildings there was a granary. And this granary was enormous, much larger than even a very large population would need at the time, because they were doing fantastic exports of grain and of attendant foodstuffs. And so they became all of a sudden increasingly bloated in the sense that they made cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa that were too large for the geography, for the history, for the topography that anyone knew about at the time. And so they literally leached themselves away from the natural base that could support their civilization, and it began to crumble. It began to fade, and it's exactly at that time that the sword-bearing, chariot-bearing, horse-plumed warriors came in through the Khyber Pass and considered these degenerate, dark-skinned, flat-nosed barbarians. And increasingly, as the Rig Veda came into play, it was the Aryan Vedic gods that now took over the way in which an Indra, with his lightning bolt-like, warlike capacities, the Greek equivalent of it, from the same peoples coming through the Scythians, coming into Greece, brought Zeus. And so you have, at the same time, in Greece, one of the divine personages who is not at all a part of the Olympian god 12, 6 female goddesses and 6 male gods, not a part of that 12-form Olympian godhead, but nevertheless the most powerful of all of the gods was Dionysus. Dionysus, who then could take the grain that had made the bread and further understand that the fermentation can also make the wine. You not only can have bread, but you can have wine. And so Dionysius is the further refinement of that fermentation to make the wine, the god of wine, where everything of nature that Mother Nature has made is now capable of being wine, inebriation, something new. And in the India civilization, outside of the Rig Veda gods, is an energy, divinity called Shiva. And it is Shiva with his Shakti that is like Dionysus and his Maenads. The Maenads are the women who leave the city, who leave the town, leave their husbands, leave their families, leave that masculine hierarchical social order to go and be there in the openness, not the wilderness, but in the openness of nature again. And so Dionysus and Shiva are related together. And next week there's a beautiful study done of Dionysus and Shiva about 35, 40 years ago. almost nobody mentions it. Nobody seems to have read it. Nobody seems to have understood. This is a major insight. But Shiva does not have his energy without his Shakti. It is the Shakti, it is the feminine, and it is the great goddess of Shakti who is the archetypal mother. This study published in Pune in 1987. Pune is in the western part of India, below Bombay. Shubhanga Atre, and she subentitles The Archetypal Mother, A Systematic Approach to Harappan Religion. She is the understandable, ancient great goddess that in the Indus civilization was the lady of the animals. Later on, the way in which it was skewed is that the caste system, to marginalize and minimalize this great goddess, who then was called Kali, that she is the lady of beasts. Men and women who follow into her worship become bestial beasts. In this way, the skews begin to come into play. And in the Rig Veda, the first of 4 Vedas, the other 3 Vedas are rearrangements of the Rig Veda with some additions. One of the first was Atharva Veda, and Atharvan was supposed to be the son of Shiva, not really so. It is this quality that begins to illuminate that there is a great east-west, north-south parallel going on here. 2 great caravan routes developing eventually, almost at the same time, written languages. The far west of Sargon's realm, by about 2000 BC, developed an alphabetical written language about the same time that the great Central Asian civilization developed written Avestan. That the original written languages, cuneiform in one, and early qualities of being a phonetic revision of the pictographic, logographic languages that they came across. The Harappan civilization had largely, originally, a logographic or a pictographic civilization writing, which only recently has been translated more or less by focusing on the imagery become the cores of the writing, and it's only later on that the sound, the phonetics, come into play and modify that. Just as in Chinese, one has pictographic languages originally, and by the time dynastic China refines itself about 1500 BC again, from the first dynasty Xia, kind of a phantom dynasty, into the Shang. And with the Shang, one has Shang bronzes. One has not just the early jade and chariots and horses and new plants and new fruits and so on and so forth, but one now has a domestic Chinese power civilization, a masculine hierarchy power civilization. The Shang are not only famous for the bronze ceremonial implements that suddenly show a great forceful power and social structure, but it has the ability to have Bronze Age dynastic reach. Just as you find wherever the Bronze Age comes into play, it is the glitter of the bronze sword, the bronze helmet, the bronze shields that are able to literally penetrate and decimate copper-based instruments, copper-based uses, and it is all due to a very rare element. It's due to tin. By being able to smelt the original copper with a small percentage of tin and occasionally a very smidgen of arsenic brought into play, one can make a very sharp-edged, serviceable bronze. And the Bronze Age came in this way and disappeared this way as well. Because what replaced the Bronze Age was the age of iron. Because an iron arrow will go right through a bronze shield and kill the user. A bronze sword will be able to be mangled by an iron sword. And so the Iron Age replaces the Bronze Age, which replaced a kind of a Silver Age, which also then replaced an early Gold Age. And now you have the 4 ages with the 4 metals that is current all the way to the Roman Empire, written down by Ovid in the Metamorphoses about 8 AD. 8 AD. When the Metamorphoses was published in Rome in 8 AD, making Ovid clearly the only competitor to Virgil as the epic poet of the Roman Empire. Exactly at that time, at 8 AD, a 17-year-old Mary Magdalene left Tyre, and her brother, who owned the shipping company for that eastern part of the Mediterranean, took her personally on one of their trading ships. The trading company was ancient Semitic trading company, set up in times of Sargon, of Akkad. Not only to go to Cyprus, but to eventually go to Rhodes, to Crete, to many other places in the Aegean, and also to Egypt and so forth. And the 17-year-old Mary Magdalene was brought by her brother Lazarus to Alexandria to reunite with the 17-year-old Jesus in Alexandria. All of these are nexes that form the sets of resonance that come into play as sets upon sets of resonance that make a very grand instrument. When you have all of the notes that make up the resonance of an octave, and then you collect the octaves together, 11 of them in this case, now you have a piano. Now you are able to make a new kind of music. This kind of an instrument is where we are now in putting together for the first time civilization with a capital C. This is, as one of my jazz friends used to say, this is Gabriel's high C, where Gabriel's horn hits the high C. That's the high Dharma note. It's like the note that Joshua proverbially sounded before the walls of Jericho, and those walls came tumbling down. Because when you hit the high C, what is already crumbling, what is already decayed, because it has run out of time energy. And when you're out of time, you're out of energy. You're out of gas, you're out of fuel. You can have a whole fleet of Panzer tanks, and when they're out of gas, it's so much rust. That's where we are now, 2014. In Egypt in 1500 BC came Hatshepsut, the first and only real powerful female pharaoh. This is the title page of a great book on Hatshepsut, my copy that I redid the title page. Came out in 1996. Joyce Tyndsley, The Female Pharaoh. She was Pharaoh 1473 to 1458 BC. This is her remains that was confirmed and discovered. Science Daily had an article on it. It dates from Halloween of 2007. That's when it was confirmed that this forgotten mummy inside that decaying ancient swaddling for 3,500 years was Hatshepsut. And her great obelisk, these are handout pages for those who are following in a way in which it's sharing. This is her obelisk at Karnak, which is still standing. This was her great friend, and his name was Sennemut, and Sennemut was a great male companion to her in the sense of being able to translate her vision and her understanding into activity, like the practical arm of things. And he was also her lover and was the father of their daughter. And this is the daughter being held by the father. And this is a great, they only show a little bit, but there's a great block, like a cube, full of hieroglyphs on all four sides. This is his head and her head. This was the Pharaoh's mitochondrial daughter who had that mitochondrial DNA and could have passed it on. There is much more to understand, much more to appreciate. The key came about 200 BC in Alexandria, when a great swath of all of this came plunging together for the first time and almost bouncing off each other. And about 200 BC, it's usually dated by the great R.H. Charles's 196 BC. The great vision of Enoch was written down and published, and augmented then by 3 other parts to it, so it became a 4-part, not a frame of reference so much, but a square of attention. Because the original vision of Enoch was that fallen angels, those beings that live in heaven, who have come down to earth, saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took them as wives, took them, had children by them. And those children were smarter, stronger than men and became giants. Giants in the sense that they took over the liveliness of power, because the fallen angels, there were about 200 of them, the vision of Enoch has. And those 4 books of the book of Enoch are all found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but what is not found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were the terminus of their final burial, was 31 BC. The 5th book of Enoch is not a part of that. It is the quintessence of how all 4 of that coming together is transformed by a 5th, a visionary quintessential 5th that goes into the space, the entire space of the frame. and exudes without any bounds, so it's that the frame floats in an openness field. And it's that fifth book of Enoch that is so important that when the book of Enoch in the Hermeneia series, the great biblical commentary of the late 20th, early 21st century, published in 2001, did not include the fifth book, the second vision of Enoch, because it had not been written at the time that the other 4 volumes came out. The fifth book of Enoch was written in 3 AD. It was written by Joseph, who was the father of Jesus, when he realized that his son, at age 12, was ready for his proverbial year of study to prepare for his bar mitzvah. And so Joseph wrote what became the second vision of Enoch, which has 3 parables, so that the parables of Jesus are due to the cues of his father for his bar mitzvah study, because he was being sent back to Alexandria by the shipping company of Lazarus, whose father had contracted leprosy, and so Lazarus had to take over the business. Not only take over the business, he had to take over his younger sister, Mary, in Tyre, where the business was. The older sister, Martha, was put in charge of a new house in Bethany, next to the leper colony in the cemetery region of the far reaches of the Mount of Olives, the other side. And there, the 12-year-old Mary Magdalene, their original home was in Magdala on the Sea of Galilee, met the 12-year-old Jesus on his way to Alexandria to do his studying for his maturation. Only it wasn't a 1-year maturation. He extended his study for another almost 12 years and didn't become the head of the therapeutic community until he was 23. And by that time, after 6 years with him, Mary Magdalene also was becoming 23. Had known each other since they were 12, had had that spontaneous, infinite field, fertile zero field opening. So the Parayana has many aspects to it that are being woven not into just a fabric, but into a way of realization. The great Enoch seminars held on a world-class level, one of the first was Enoch and Qumran Origins, and one of the last was Enoch and the Messiah, Son of Man, revisiting the book of parables. More next week.